Hello, folks. This is Dr. Matt Moynihan here, doing another episode of Fusion Oral History. This lecture is going to be on inertial electrostatic confinement fusion, or IEC fusion approaches, which is sort of the black sheep of the fusion family. Unlike mirrors and tokamaks and pinches and other prominent fusion approaches, the IEC family is it grew independent of ivory tower academics and outside of national laboratories. It was more driven by commercial offshoots for television and later hobbyists, and ultimately it became a commercial endeavor. And today it's one of the only examples right now of fusion technology on the commercial marketplace. But it's an often forgotten corner of the nuclear fusion area, and that's the reason why we're going to talk about it today. So IEC starts the IEC can be traced back to the work of one individual named Philo T. Farnsworth. Philo T. Farnsworth is famous for his invention of the television. He was one of the first pioneers of television, and patented it and developed the Philo T. Farnsworth lab around it. And he's portrayed in popular media by Professor Farnsworth on the show Futurama. He's a prominent character on there, and that's kind of an accurate depiction. I don't know if he'd have contested with that. But he was born in the early 1900s in the West, in the United States, back when they didn't have electric lights. And he grew up in you can think of it almost like a one-room farmhouse out in plowing the fields out when he was a teenager, when he was a boy and a teenager. Fell in love with science and read kind of Buck Rogers and other cartoon science fiction type novels. This is all documented, by the way, in the book The Boy Who Invented Television, which was written by Paul Shitskin in the early 2000s. And he interviewed Philo T. Farnsworth's wife. So if you want a more detailed explanation of Philo Farnsworth's life, you should check that out. But in high school physics class, he came up with the idea for the television by deflecting a beam of electrons through an electric and magnetic field, basically applying plates on a vacuum tube in such a way that you could vary the direction of a beam of electrons, and so that they would strike a screen in front and illuminate different parts of the screen. And you could project images. Essentially, you could take an electrical signal, apply it to the plates, and that would deflect the beam, which would then cause a signal to form. So already right there, you see that Philo Farnsworth, as a teenager, is learning about particles, vacuum systems, electric and magnetic fields, and manipulating all three of these different things in a way to make something that was practical and useful. And that's a great, that sets the stage really well for the skill sets that one needs in nuclear fusion, which is essentially the same skill sets of vacuum, plasma, fields, electric and magnetic fields, and manipulating all of that to get a desired behavior. In fusion, it's all about getting hot, dense material all packed together and controlled. In television, it's about directing beams of particles to illuminate specific parts of a screen. So Philo Farnsworth goes to college, studies this, develops this technology, patents it through the years, eventually gets into the commercial arena and either patents or licenses or competes with RCA Television at the time, and eventually creates his own company, Farnsworth Laboratories, with his wife, who was his dedicated supporter. So the two of them basically ran the business together. Philo was the head honcho inventor and brainiac scientist, and she did books, promotion, business stuff, contracts, and supervised hiring and things. Philo Farnsworth Labs was in Chicago area, the greater Chicago area, in the 50s and 60s, after he had made his money through the television. And he was experimenting with new ideas in the same realm and stumbled across a concept called the fuser. Fusers emerge from a multiplexer thing, which I won't go into now. But essentially, a fuser is two wire cages inside a vacuum chamber. They're concentric, so there's one tight little wire cage on the inside, one bigger cage on the outside. In a vacuum, the vacuum is pumped down using a turbo pump and a roughing pump and then turbo pump. And then sometimes you can inject in like a noble gas like argon or something to push out any stray gas. So once you form the vacuum, you then puff in the fusion fuel, which is typically deuterium, which comes as a gas in a big cylinder, and you've got a little valve and you puff it in. And then you apply a voltage between the outer and inner cage. So 10,000 volts is typically the minimum that you would want to do to start seeing fusion. 10,000 volts translates to 10,000 EV or 10K EV, which is sort of comparable temperatures for plasmas inside an ICF implosion or other conditions where you'd see fusion. So as the gas comes in, it enters the first cage, and if it heats up beyond 16 EV, which is roughly the first ionization energy of hydrogen, the electron gets stripped off, and then it just becomes a positive, rarefied nucleus that sees that inner cage and goes into it because it sees that voltage. Now, when it enters between the outer and inner cage, it's now under a voltage field, and it's positive, so it's falling down towards a negative inner cage. And it's falling down a voltage drop, which is essentially like a rock falling down a hill. As it falls down this voltage drop, its kinetic energy rises, it speeds up, it speeds up, it speeds up, and it usually hits the inner cage. About 97% of the time, the positive ion goes into the inner cage, collides with the inner cage, and starts heating up the inner cage and melting it. But a small percentage of the material misses the inner cage, flies into the center, and collides with another ion. And if it does at those conditions, it can fuse. That's how a fuser works. So just to review again, you've got two cages of voltage between the cages. Ions come in, they ionize, they fall down the voltage, they miss the inner cage, they collide and fuse. It's a cheap, simple, easy way to do nuclear fusion. It also exploits a very direct method for heating plasma to fusion conditions, just applying an electric voltage. Particle accelerators do the same thing. They apply an electric voltage in a circle, which heats beams of particles up to fusion conditions. So it's very simple. It's easy. It's an easy thing to do. Philo Farnsworth built the first fusers at Farnsworth T Labs in the greater Chicago area, and he was looking at them for fusion energy production. But the problem was with the fuser is that most of that material does go into that first cage. Instead of missing and colliding and doing fusion, it's more driving mass and energy into that first wire cage, causing it to heat up, causing it to melt, causing it to degrade with time. And it's not a process that ramps up well. You can take a fuser up to 110, 100 volts, 100,000 volts, 110,000 volts, 120,000 volts. That sort of voltage. And of course, as you turn up the voltage, you do get higher rates of fusion, more fusion events occurring, but you also get more collisions on the inner cage, which causes that inner cage to heat up faster. And essentially, you're creating an electrical process where you're trying to pit your voltage source against this negative current that's flowing into the inner cage that's kind of fighting against the two. So you've got a voltage source that's trying to maintain a voltage while you've got a plasma that's driving the voltage down simultaneously. So the two effects are fighting against one another, causing for a very inefficient machine that also melts, and that also most of the material does not do fusion at all. So as a fusion concept, fusers don't work as a power plant. But as I said, they're very cheap, simple, and easy to build. So Philo Farnsworth was there. One of the persons that came and worked with him was Robert Hirsch, who will enter the story later in the Mirror program, but he becomes director of what is now the Department of Energy Office of Fusion Energy Sciences, and becomes a national leader and advocate for nuclear fusion research until he leaves the department in the 80s, 82, around then. So fusers are fun technology. They don't translate well to fusion power. And for probably 20 years or 30 years, they're not actively pursued in a big way until the late 90s, when a group of people, starting principally with a man named Richard Hull, start building amateur fusing machines, fusers, in their homes and garages. Richard Hull is an engineer in the Richmond, Virginia area. He's a boomer, and he happens to have a very nice laboratory shed behind his home. And about 1997, 98, and 99, he starts building a fuser in his garage and starts testing and experimenting with this thing. And in 1999, he becomes the first amateur. I say the word amateur because he wasn't part of a lab or a profession or a university or anything. He starts building and getting nuclear fusion in his garage, in his shed outside his house. Actually, there's a great video from the New York Times where he was interviewed about this. Since then, he's been included in multiple articles on fusion, and he becomes the head of Fuser.net, which is an online community of people in North America that have built and done nuclear fusion devices based around the fuser concept in their homes, garages, and workshops around the country. Some of the most notable people of that community, one of them was Taylor Wilson, who was 11, 12-year-old kid at the time, living in Texarkana. And he attended a magnet program at a university, and partnering with some university technicians, they build a fuser, and he gets fusion at the age of 12 or 13. So becomes one of the youngest people in the world to do nuclear fusion, and because of that, he becomes a minor celebrity. They wrote a book about him, The Boy Who Played with Fusion, which is a pretty interesting book about parenting and growing a genius in your home, and you can check that out. He also ends up giving talks at the IAE and gets invited to the White House, and was featured in a number of news articles and stories. He was on NBC News. He ends up going in for Going College, and he's involved in Silicon Valley startups right now. But so he's one of the stories that popularizes fusion and fusers nationally. And then after Taylor Wilson, there were a variety of teenagers. There was a Conrad fella. There were two kids in New Jersey. There was a kid in England who broke Taylor Wilson's record as becoming the youngest person. He built a fuser and did nuclear fusion in his middle school. About that same time, in 2010, Carl Greninger, who is a Microsoft manager out in Seattle, Washington, Federal Way, Washington, him and his wife decide that they could use the fuser for high school education of physics. And so Carl goes and builds a fuser in his garage, and then goes out to local high schools and finds local high school teachers, physics teachers, and says, hey, I could use this thing. We could get some kids over and get them doing science experiments on my fuser, and they could go out and win science fairs and win college scholarships. And it would be a great way to train up a generation of folks that could get involved in the nuclear field in a big way. And so starting in 2010, they formed something called the Northwest Nuclear Consortium. They have a website up. You can check it out. And Carl is now taking classes between 20 and 25 people, kids from local high schools, every Friday or over the weekend or during the week. They come to his home and learn the curriculum for nuclear power plants. So the equivalent to what a nuclear worker would go through if they wanted to work in a nuclear power plant. So OSHA certified curriculum. And then they take the test, and they actually receive a state issued certification that allows them to work on a nuclear facility. So that's one of the parts of Carl's program for high school students. One of the reasons why the parents like it so much is because he couldn't do that if he didn't have safety certified programs. In fact, they had a state inspector from the office of the Washington State Office of Nuclear Science and Protection come to Carl's house and certify the program after some parents took an interest. So, Carl, that's one of the first things the kids do. They also learn a curriculum of nuclear science, including some of the history around the development of nuclear technology. And then they go and they work on the nuclear fuser itself. So, Carl's fuser is one of the best amateur categories of machines in the country. He has been able to produce 10 to the 6th, 10 to the 7th, 10 to the 8th neutrons per second, so very high fusion rates. And he's experimented with different gases in the center. They tried nitrogen, argon, xenon. They've tried different configurations of the inner cathode, one of them being sort of a ring scenario where the plasma actually forms beams. And they've tried irradiating different samples of things with the neutrons that come off of fusion reactions. So they have petri dishes where they subject like cells to neutron damage and bombardment, and then chart growth and chart regrowth of the particle of the biological samples. All of this, by the way, becomes science fair projects at Seattle, in the Seattle area, the county level state science fair projects, the state level, Washington state level science fair projects, where teenagers are now doing nuclear fusion, and then they're presenting work related to nuclear fusion in terms of design of cathode or biological experiments or testing different gases or testing different plasma configurations. And then they go to the national level and then the Intel International Science and Engineering Fair, where Carl's team actually came in first place and third place in different categories, including the physics category for their nuclear fusion work. So collectively, Northwest Nuclear Consortium has produced dozens of successful students that have gone on to college and graduate school and won over $500,000 in college scholarships by winning and crushing at science fairs. So he's got one of the best educational curriculums for high school students around nuclear fusion and nuclear in general. He's got hands-on physics experiments, and he reminds me of every high school coach that I ever knew. And he plays an important part in the field of IEC and the world of amateur fusion. And I just thought it was really important to recognize all the quality work that's going on out in Seattle. IEC, more formally, does get studied in the mid-90s at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at a machine called Homer. Homer is a academic machine and team run by Gerald Kucinich and John Sanitarius, who are both full professors or associate professors at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In the mid-1990s, they have a PhD student named Thorson, who does the first formal academic study of the fuser itself. So Jim Thorson, looks at the fuser under different operating conditions and maps out different operating modes for the device. So he actually comes up with 4 different modes. Star mode, which looks like a star inside the center. You can see a picture of it there. Halo mode, which is where the fuser creates just sort of a glow, and then converged core mode, which is where the gas is so rarefied and so thin that there isn't very much plasma. So of these 3 operating conditions, star mode has the most performance, and the way you switch between them is you change the gas pressure inside the chamber so that you get different behavior. Now, in the context of that, there's also things that form around specific configurations of the cage that you have, for instance, plasma channels, where you can see a lot of plasma streaming through a specific spot from one cathode to another. So he experiments with that and sort of lays that out all in his 1997-1998 thesis, where he spells out all these different operating conditions. And of course, this is historic because it's the first time that IEC's really been formally operated on. in an academic standard. Homer, by the way, is still going. It's part of a bigger program at Wisconsin-Madison. And Homer's the neutrons from Homer and the electrical sources and power sources around Homer and the helicon work all become different scientific papers and theses through the years. Sanitarius also organized a joint conference between the United States, aka the Wisconsin-Madison Laboratory, and Japan. They have a 2-year biannual meeting every year for many, many years, where Japan has an IEC program and they cross-present and cross-promote their fusion work. So the IEC community and the IEC conference is a very small subset of the larger fusion community, a larger American Physics Society conference. I mean, IEC conference, I went to the 2014 conference and there might have been 100 people there total. I mean, this isn't a very big community when you compare it against the tokamak community and other communities. One of the PhD students that's at Wisconsin in the early 2000s, well, there were two, Greg Pfeiffer and Ross Radel, who were both working on the Homer machine for different parts of their PhD thesis. Now, Greg Pfeiffer, when he was in graduate school, also had a company that he was running out of his residence with a fellow grad student in the computer space, and they were selling little computer bits and cards. And he saw the value of having a commercial company early on, so he thought of a way to combine essentially what he was doing for his PhD, which was fuser work and fusion, with the entrepreneurial spirit, and started a company called Phoenix Nuclear Laboratory in 2005. This was done in conjunction with Ross Radel, although Ross left right after to do a postdoc at a national laboratory, and he was also at the Bettis Atomic Power Labs for a brief period as an intern doing nuclear stuff, before coming back to Wisconsin in 2008-2009 timeframe. Greg essentially lured him back to Wisconsin to work on the private company stuff. But Phoenix starts out as a SBIR firm that wins their first contract, essentially building a power supply for the Homer machine at Wisconsin, which they were the only people that said that they could do it or were willing to do it. And part of the constraint was they had to fit the power source through the door of the laboratory. And they didn't have any readily available contractor that could build a power source that would provide enough juice for Homer that could also fit inside the building. And so Phoenix, the company that Greg founds, says, we can do this. And they went out and won an SBIR to do that. And they go off and win a series of phase 1 and phase 2 SBIR seed funding from the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy around building fusers and using the neutrons for various applications like imaging or medical isotopes or power supplies or something else along those lines. And while he's doing this, Greg formulates the vision for the company, which is to develop neutron sources based on fusion reactions. So fusers work and they create neutrons, but they don't actually create net power. But you can use the neutrons for all sorts of fun things like medical isotope productions. I should say, by the way, that this wasn't the first time that this had happened. Actually, the very first neutron source or commercial technology based off of fusion using neutrons was in Europe in 2000. There was a fella out there working at Daimler Chrysler who had a vision for a neutron source based off of fusion reaction based off of a fuser. And him and his wife worked very, very hard for many years to develop a machine that did that. And it was a company called NSD Gradle. And this was in the late 1990s and early 2000s in Europe. NSD Gradle premiered with a machine that was about 100,000 to 300,000 that fused deuterium or deuterium-tritium in a beam format. And so for about that amount of money, you could buy a scientific instrument that was maybe a meter long, that had a control system that shot neutrons out the one side at 10 to the 6th up to 10 to the 8th or 10 to the 9th, depending on if you had deuterium or tritium. These were great for scientific experiments where they were trying to irradiate materials or test the feasibility of first wall materials under neutron loads. If you know anything about neutronics, though, you'll know that fission reactors, this isn't anywhere near what a fission power plant would experience. Fission power plants are up in the 10 to the 18th, 10 to the 19th, 10 to the 20th, 21st level of neutrons. So this is a much lower potency of neutron source, and so therefore it was hard to gain traction for fusers or fuser-related commercial technology outside for fission applications, because they couldn't really simulate what was going on inside the nuclear core, and so therefore it was hard to make money selling to that space. But so that was in early 2000. So let's jump back to Shine or Phoenix. Greg Pfeiffer and Ross Radel now are back together in about 2010. They've got Phoenix going. It's a team of maybe 10 to 20 people. They've won a series of SBIR funding. And now that that technology is pretty far along, Greg realizes that we need to go and go after medical isotopes. So essentially, you can use the neutrons from a nuclear reaction, a fusion reaction. If you direct the neutrons to one place, you can transmute material and make technetium-99 or moly-99, which is the basic feeder stock for medical isotopes. Medical isotopes are a $1 billion a year industry. Now it's probably closer to $6 billion a year, where these isotopes are injected into a person's bloodstream, and then the person goes under radiation, X-ray radiation, and the scientists can get a snapshot of the blood vessels and organs and other things inside a person's body. They're not radioactive. They're safe for medical use. They're approved. Medical isotopes, that technology goes way back to the 50s and 60s in New York University and New York School of Medicine, Rosalind Yallow's work. But anyway, the current industry is coming from fission reactors that have been converted and use the neutrons off of a traditional, like, pressurized water reactor to convert that material into medical isotopes. And there was an example. There was a reactor in South Africa. There was a reactor in Canada. Greg thought that using fusion and using the neutrons from fusion, and fusion developed from IEC fusers, would be a much smaller, faster, cheaper, better commercial path to mass producing medical isotopes. And then once that was done, he could then make a fortune, turn that money and profit and revenue engine back on, and funnel that stuff back into fusion development. So he saw it as a way to get into the commercial game around fusion, and that was the vision for the company. And so in 2010, he steps away from Phoenix Nuclear Labs and founds a medical company called Shine Medical Technologies in Janesville, Wisconsin in 2010, with the explicit goal of taking the neutron generators developed by Phoenix from IECs and from the Homer Project in Wisconsin and turning it into a medical isotope facility. And Shine gets a big boost early on. They sign a $100 million deal with GE Healthcare. They get funding from a Wisconsin state entity. They get funding from venture capitalists in the area, and they go after design and licensing of that plant. They enter into NRC regulations, and about the same time, Phoenix has now set a world record for the best performing neutron generator on the market. They, in about 2014, 15, and 16, they premiere the Thunderbird. The Thunderbird is $1 million piece of equipment. It's about the size of a car, and it can do nuclear fusion and produce neutrons at 10 to the 11th to 10 to the 13th, depending on if you add tritium or not, for 180 hours continuously. 180 hours continuously, which is essentially a world record for any machine that's doing nuclear fusion forever at that density of fusion reactions per second. So Thunderbird is now on the market, and that's from Phoenix. And Shine is essentially a spin-off company that's going to take the Thunderbird and then build a entire manufacturing process and get it certified by both the NRC and the FDA to produce medical isotopes, and then go off and form partnerships with various isotope distributors to sell this product across the United States and Canada, China, Asia, and the EU, Europe. So Greg is now leading that company. He grows the company to a staff of over 100, and they get venture capital and funding. They end up recruiting Paul Ryan, who is a former presidential candidate, and he's from Janesville, Wisconsin. And he acts on their board as a political wedge to basically get them political clout and help them push through their NRC nuclear site license and application, which eventually does get site license. And now the plant is, I think, fully built and operating in Janesville. They also had plans to build a plant in Indonesia and a plant in Europe. So Shine is now a success story, and it's well on its way to becoming the dominant player in the medical isotope industry, which has now grown to a $5 to $6 billion industry in 2021. And Shine has now re-adopted Phoenix, so it's been reintegrated back into the Shine family of technologies, so that they can streamline all the back-end processes, HR and bookkeeping and all those great things. Along the way, the Thunderbird device ends up becoming useful for another application, which is imaging. So you can put devices under neutron rays and essentially take what is equivalent to an X-ray snapshot of the internals of parts, from bullets to chambers to structural materials to things with cracks and other things. So they open a national neutron imaging center, which has a contract model where companies can take products that they want imaged to Wisconsin, get them imaged, get the data, and then get a good snapshot of what's going on inside their materials. Along the way, they propose using the Thunderbird for some sort of fission reaction or fission material test stand, or a test stand for nuclear fusion research like at Commonwealth and other places. So Shine and Phoenix, again, this whole lineage starts back in the early 2000s, late 90s with the Homer machine, and then moves forward into now what is considered a multi-billion dollar, multi-hundreds of millions of dollar commercial company that I think is going to have major market impact. So it's an example of how fusion research that's going into an esoteric field like IEC and fusers could then eventually spur a huge commercial opportunity and a huge commercial entity that's now going to impact the United States and the larger nuclear market. So IEC is still around. It's still being followed by amateur fusioneers and hobbyists. It's a great way to learn about the market. A number of people in big private fusion companies actually started out as high school kids that were building fusers in their garages, and then pursued it and went on to grad school and other places. Part of the IEC story that I'd like to talk about is Tom Maguire. Tom Maguire is probably most well known for his work at the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works on nuclear fusion. He had something called the compact fusion reactor, which was an approach that I'll discuss in another lecture on CUSPs. CFR ran from 2007 to 2019, 2020. But Tom Maguire actually started as a PhD student under Ray Sedgwick at MIT in the early 2000s, and his thesis was on multi-weld fusers, which is an interesting problem if you think about it. So I described earlier a basic fuser has two wire cages, one inside the other. The multi-weld fuser has multiple cages, one inside the other. And the goal with the multi-well is to try to play games with the voltage on each one of the shells or cages to get more behavior or less behavior, or optimize to get more of what you want, less of what you hate. Tom Maguire's thesis was on that. He built multi-weld fusers and tried to experiment with different ways to improve their efficiency or get denser plasma or do other things there. And it's just an interesting bit of work that then Dr. McGuire went off and led a huge effort at Lockheed Martin over over 15 years and 60 million in funding, and over almost 60 staffers went through that program. So that's enough for now on fusers and IEC. Again, you can get the book, which has more details on Philo Farnsworth. It has all these pictures, and you get all this information in a nice glossy textbook with nice photos. Hope you're doing well. Take care.